Dr David Clark.
Well, Mr Speaker, pleasure to rise to speak to this bill, and as my colleague Clayton Cosgrove has indicated, the Labor Party will be supporting this bill to Select Committee, where Melissa Lee is the chair, and we will look forward very much to the debate around what this bill has to offer and how New Zealanders can benefit from it, and if necessary make recommendations for tweaking or amending the bill should it prove after submissions from interested parties that it can be improved upon, or if there are fishhooks in it that we haven't yet spotted. But on the surface, of course, what it does is it makes the regime more responsive to consumers, and that's got to be a good thing. On this side of the House, we recognise the importance of trade for this country. New Zealand is a trading nation. It is the way we make our way in the world. And so the Labor Party has, with the exception of the TPP, with which we've had some challenges, we have supported trade right since the beginning. In fact, the first Labor government was the party that made real impact in Europe by looking for new trade avenues there, long before the National Party was even formed, before the National Party was even a perverse idea in somebody's mind. The Labor Party was out there beating the drum on trade. They will, of course, have a difference of opinion on some matters of trade, but generally there has been a bipartisan consensus across this House that trade is an important thing. We will continue, of course, notwithstanding this bill, to challenge the government. It has set itself the test of getting exports up to 40% of GDP since it came to office, and it has in fact gone backwards during its time, and it now sits below 30% of GDP. And we recognise that if we are going to pay our way in the world as a country, we do need to trade, and we do need to trade increasingly. And unfortunately, this government seems to be taking us in the opposite direction. But when we see a bill come along that seems a sensible trade measure, that clarifies the rules and that is in favour of consumer benefit, we want to support that bill. That's our natural instinct on this side of the House. And here, this bill allows for natural disasters and a different course of action when natural disasters happen, and essentially a relaxing of the regime that's in place, because it might be, in fact, in the country's benefit to take goods in a situation that is different to the ordinary situation, despite it technically being a case of dumping. And I've had a chance to flick through some of the background papers gathered under the Official Information Act, and can see that the Ministry itself has provided an analysis of a range of options and assessed in a handy matrix form for the Minister the range of options and whether they achieve the goals that a country might set out for itself in terms of assessing the change against the status quo and preserving the impact of anti-dumping, the good sides of anti-dumping legislation is one of the goals they've set themselves, but also providing discretion in situations that are different and giving that discretion so that the public might benefit. And they've done it in a simple tick box form that pretty much anyone could understand. And I'd encourage people at home who are interested in this kind of thing to apply for such papers under the Official Information Act. It's something I was discussing with a constituent just yesterday, how few people do use the Official Information Act. It's a favourite, of course, of journalists and politicians to get the background information, to make sure that the Minister has made the right decisions as across his or her paperwork and is acting in the best interests of the country given the advice that they have received. But ordinary members of the public out there, people in Middle New Zealand, can of course request information under the Official Information Act too, and will receive, by and large, copies of the paperwork that a Minister will receive in their decision-making process, and can see how decisions have been made, and then often that aids in the process of select committees, but can aid generally in the making of good law and the understanding of how we come to be in the situations we are as a country. Now, Mr Speaker, the first speaker for Labor, the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove, touched on the fact that businesses want clear rules. They want a level playing field for trade. They want to be sure that there isn't dumping going on that's going to affect domestic industries in a negative way because of unfair behaviours behaviours that are outside the norms of international trade and the expectations set up by trade rules, and that is fair enough, because with clear rules, some certainty and expectations, that's when businesses prosper. When the rules are clear, when the playing field's laid out and everyone is playing by the same rules, we back our New Zealand industries to be innovative, to put their best foot forward and to compete on the international scene. And we feel, of course, on this side of the house that there's more that could be done. We see some distortions in our economy. We see money going into the speculative sector in the housing market that could be going into the productive sector and supporting businesses. We see a lack of investment available for hard-working New Zealand business people. It is very hard to get the capital that people need. And of course, one of the consequences of that is that we've seen fewer businesses created under the current government per annum than we saw under the previous Labour government. And that in part is because I would contend that the party opposite is more interested in big established businesses and less interested in new businesses coming through. They're less interested in the ordinary middle New Zealander who risks their shirt every day. They're more interested in backing vested interests in the ultra-wealthy. And that's something we've seen time and time again in the nature of legislation that's brought to this House. However, today we're not criticising that. We're supporting this bill for the fact that it seems like common sense policy. It's not the big idea that's going to change things, be a game changer in New Zealand. It's not the big idea that will get us to exports reaching the government's goal of 40% of GDP rather than going backwards. It's not the big idea that will turn the corner for us and see us earning more per capita. Unfortunately, wages in New Zealand have been static under the government, and as expenses have gone up and funding in the health sector has dropped and so on, things are getting tougher for New Zealanders. This is not the thing that will change that overnight, but it does seem to be a sensible measure that we would want to support to Select Committee to have a full examination, because we do support sensible measures, albeit they small steps in the right direction. So just to remind ourselves that what we're talking about here is goods that are dumped, and they're considered to be dumped if the export price to New Zealand is less than the price the goods are sold for in the exporting country. So you can see the pattern of behaviour that's being described. Goods also that are subsidised by foreign governments can be considered to be dumped as well. Where there's a distortion in trade practices, we have legislation in place that stops dumping practices because they are and can be injurious to New Zealand industries. Where there is no New Zealand industry present, where it's unlikely that goods coming cheaply into the country are going to be injurious to an existing industry, in fact may be a benefit to consumers in New Zealand, we would support this change, and that is in fact, as I read the legislation, what it is designed to achieve, Mr. Speaker. So we only hope that this can get through in a good form. We recognise that with the criminal sanctions for cartels bill that the Minister Goldsmith brought to the House before, there was some backtracking and a curious path taken. We hope that this one has a safer journey through the Select Committee, and we ourselves will be putting ourselves with our shoulder to that cause to make sure that this legislation is debated fully, thoroughly, comes back to the House, hopefully in an improved form, because there are always good suggestions that come forward from public and interested parties, that we will bring it back to this House and debate it fully and see a better regime as a result. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call Brett Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise in support of the Trade, Anti-Dumping and Countervailing Duties Amendment Bill in its first reading.